Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston and Florian. Logos has been delayed due to some family issues. He should hopefully be here a little bit later on in the show, but we're gonna keep going. So today we're gonna talk about Ivan Illich's Three Ages of Tools. This concept is found in his interview, which was turned into a book called Rivers North of the Future, which occurred, I believe, in 2002. And this is a subsection of that interview where he outlines his theories on the development of tool use and how it affects us in the modern technical age. So one of the things that I've been grappling with for a while is people will say, well, look, a tool, technology is another tool, right? And it's not the tool that's the problem, it's how you use the tool. What is implicitly being stated here is that using this particular tool, modern technology, let's say digital communications or the internet, for example, doesn't force the user to make certain assumptions, to change the way he thinks, to change the way he acts, as if it's a completely inert substance, which it's not. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to get at with people, and why I think visiting Illich in a little more detail is going to be helpful. So, for example, if we have a tool like a hammer, you can use it to help build a shed and then put it back in the drawer. And while it's in the drawer, it's inert. It does nothing. It doesn't impose any costs on you. And then, but whereas telecommunications or airplanes, even if you don't use them, they still impose a cost on you. So, for example, one of the things that Ted Kaczynski complained about was even if you went out into the woods to build his little shack, he could still hear airplanes flying overhead. Right, so those technologies still affect you even if you don't use them. Okay, so the first type of age of tools is basically from the first time humans were using tools up until around the 1200 AD, which he calls Organon, which is Greek for organ. And the hand, the hammer, and the hammering hand, for example, in Plato, are all called Organon. So the implication here is that the tool is an extension and or part of the user, sort of like your mouth or your tongue or your stomach or your foot. And so it changes how you relate to it. Now, most of us today are so far removed from this kind of thinking. The best modern example would be anything that has to do with samurai, because usually in the training montage of a samurai, there's this moment where it's like you are one with the sword is a part of you, you are a part of the sword. That's really, in the modern context, where you're most likely going to see any residue of this type of thinking. And so what's important here is that the man incorporates the tool into his life. He determines the tool's use. But the tool is incorporated in such a way that it is considered a part of him. And then beginning in the 12th century and then going all the way down to the 1980s with the computer revolution, Illich describes a period called distality, which is rooted in the concept of distance. So the tool now, there's a distance now between the tool and the user. Rather than being an organ or organic part of the user, the tool now is considered distinct and separate from the user. So the telos or goal, the use of the tool, is not anymore determined merely by the user, but it's the tool itself. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, you might consider the sword, as the tool used by the knight to kill people. And it's so wrapped up with that whole class identity of the aristocracy that to think of it being used by a peasant or merchant would just be silly. But with the age of distality, it's just a thing that cuts. It doesn't matter who's using it. Anybody could, in theory, be trained to use it. So now there's this sharp break between the tool and the user. In modern popular culture, a good example would be Rey from episode 7. She's got no prior use using a lightsaber, but lightsabers cut things. So even though Kylo Ren has been trained to be a lightsaber user since he joined the Sith, they're fighting on equal terms. A veteran lightsaber user versus someone who's never handled one before. That's an expression of this concept of distality. Well, anybody can use it. It's just meant to cut things. But now, though, the focus, the telos of the tool has been disconnected from any sort of embeddedness. It's now in itself. That's it. So like the first age, the second age, the man still incorporates the tool into his life. He still determines its use. But now the tool has a use which is in some sense distinct from any one will of human users. And then beginning in the 1980s, he begins to discuss what's called the age of systems. So in system theory, the user is no longer something distinct from the tool, but it is an embedded part of the system. So to even think in terms of, well, I'm this user here, and this is the tool over there, within the concept of systems just falls apart because you're all a part of the tool, you're all a part of the system. And now we see a shift, a very important shift. Now the tool is determining the end of man rather than man the tool. So how often, right, do we have think of like the factory floor, right? What determines the social interactions on a factory floor? Well, it's the machine. The machine determines it. How do the workers best fit into this process of mechanization in order to produce a certain good? Now, we could just telescope this across a nation and have all these interlocking mechanisms. It now becomes the case that in the way that the four seasons and the rhythms of, say, the tide and the sea, or understanding where oases were in the desert in like pre-industrial times would condition the limits of human behavior. It's now the tool, right? Rather than nature, rather than the environment conditioning human behavior, it's now this interconnected tool system which is conditioning human behavior. So I guess a good example in popular media would be The Matrix. That's an extreme example, but humans are just completely adjunct power sources for the machine. That's taking this idea to its logical conclusion in a science fiction dystopia. And furthermore, within the system, there's no external standpoint from which we can observe ourselves or the system. So if there's any problems in the system that can't be solved by the system, they just go unsolved because you have to actually step outside of the system to look at it. And as long as you're embedded in it, you can't do that. So the main point here is that the system incorporates, oh, Lucas is here, great. The system incorporates man into its own self. And now the last thing is the social element that all ties it together is need satisfaction. So Illich talks about need satisfaction, where humans have needs, and he argues that in a technical society, those are best met by professionals and experts. The problem is it dehumanizes and de-individuates people. They're just social problems that need to be solved. You don't actually build real connections to them. Furthermore, the interesting question is, are even these needs, is this even the right way to treat the needs? Because if there's in some sense you need a social connection, then clearly just having anonymous experts come in isn't really going to do the work. So there's some conclusions that come from all this, as I already started this conversation, saying technology is just another tool is faulty, because unlike the prior two ages of tools, it's the tool that incorporates man and determines his end rather than the other way around. That's so fundamental. Most people just don't see that. Systems thinking narrows one's intellectual horizon, so it becomes difficult to solve problems, especially if the system itself is causing the problem. And then by treating people as expressions of social ills rather than people that need to have social relations, you create a more isolated society, which broadly feeds into my broader critique of mental health and technology. So we'll start with you, Florian. What are your takes on this introduction?
Yeah, very good point. I got reminded, and I maybe go a little bit further back in history. When Apple came back on the scene in 2001, or basically in the 90s, Apple computers was a shadow of what it is now. I mean, there's no comparison. Apple computer was something for the idealist designer guy, but not for normal people who use computers. And the things that Apple computers could do, they were laughable. I mean, there was always a little hook with it. Like when you wanted to do something like use word processing or whatever other software, it never quite worked like you would have on a PC. And also when iTunes came out, and iTunes still does that, it saves the songs in a very weird format. Like it's not really ordered at all. So it's very strange. So Apple computers claim to be better, but then they also weren't even able to do so many basic tasks. Back then, you could get a PC, outfit it better, and it was more useful than an Apple and cheaper to boot. And now then, going a few years further ahead, in 2001, when Apple brought out the iPod, that was an example of design being better than technology. There were many MP3 players around back then, but they had better technology than an iPod. But everyone sort of like got sold on this concept of design being better. So basically, it is not only that technology was going away from a tool like a hammer that you use. It was also starting to stunt your imagination, because you couldn't do all the things that you thought you would do with a computer. With those products, you couldn't really do them, but they had a nice design, right? So everyone kind of got unified on that. And everyone thought, oh, it's so beautiful and so nice. And it wasn't even important to people whether the underlying technology was good. So few years forward, and we're now in an area where you could argue that Apple, Facebook, all these other social media technology companies, they kind of like engineered society in a way where society does what the tool wants to do from it, not what society wants to do with the tool. You're not really free to use computers as you want. You kind of allow to use them as a technology allows, and it goes also into this notion that maybe AI isn't so much in danger of becoming more intelligent than we are, but we are in danger of becoming as dumb as AI is. So not AI becomes more conscious than us, so we are losing consciousness relative to AI. If you use ChatGPT for everything, well, yeah, then your thinking becomes stunted over time and aligns with the kind of answers that ChatGPT is giving, right? I don't know whether you saw it right recently. Elon Musk has brought out a new collection of robots, autonomous robots. They called them Optimus, and you can see they are still in testing, but they could already be function as a barkeeper, or they could have a normal conversation. Imagine like a robot, looks like a human. It's a plastic head, right? It doesn't have human contours in the face, but it looks like a robot. It can give answers like a normal person, like a little bit superficial answers, maybe. From what I've seen was like some San Francisco tech elite people asking the robots, and the robots was kind of like superficially, yeah, everything is great. But you could totally see that those robots will shape a conversation in the future that goes away from being useful to people, that kind of everyone gets lodged into this certain way of talking to one another, and a certain mindset taking on, certain ideology to take on. And so now technology is not just more than a tool. It's not only always present and costs us like an airplane that's always over our heads. It starts to shape us back. So basically, it's not we use the hammer uses us to mold us into the structures that the hammer wants to produce, right? And a third point, and that is there's a movement on YouTube. You should look it up. It's called the Right to Repair. There's one guy who started on YouTube. I think he's a computer technology repair guy in New York, and he encountered something that like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, companies like Apple and other big corporations, they wouldn't allow you to repair the computers. Like the Apple computer in the beginning, the display was held with magnets. You could take it off, and then you could change out some chips or repair. Now the display is glued. So if you take the glue away, if you try to put it back together, it never works as well as before. If you use non-approved RAM chips for the computer, the chips that Apple doesn't want you to use, the computer may stop working altogether. And it's now also so far that in agriculture, farmers can't even repair their tractors themselves anymore. They need to have explicit permission by the company. And so that started this right to repair movement, where people were trying to push back, being allowed to repair the devices that they have. But that shows you the entire absurdity. Not only is it, as the tool that we use now, additional costs, we cannot even operate it. It's not even our tool anymore, right? And those are three parts that I see as very detrimental for our future.
Yeah, those are all very good points, Florian. Thanks. Keith.
Yeah, Illich argues that during these phases of evolution of technology, that technology has gone from being something that humans use as a tool to something that humans are dominated by. And I think that that corresponds with social evolution in a wider sense, where if we look at the evolution of institutions over time, we see that as technology has become more sophisticated, and 80 or 90% of all the technology that we have today is no more than 150 years old. Like, somebody living in 1850 probably has more in common with people in ancient Babylon than people, say living in 1850 and people today. So that's how much technology has exploded in the last century and a half. And parallel to the technological explosion, we have seen the growth of these mass institutions and mass bureaucratic apparatuses that dominate modern society, what James Burnham called the managerial revolution. For those that aren't familiar with Burnham, back in the early 40s, James Burnham wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, where he argued that something interesting was happening that transcended different societies, where you had all these different societies where industrialization had taken place, and irrespective of their formal ideology, whether it was democracy or capitalism or socialism or communism or fascism or whatever, and irrespective of their particular form of government, whether it was a constitutional republic or personal dictatorship. One thing that all of these different types of societies had was the development of this mass managerial bureaucracy. And the managerial bureaucracy wasn't just the state, it wasn't just the state institutions, but it was something that existed in institutions of any kind, whether it was business or labor or foundations or universities or church or whatever. And then the question that arises that because we've had this managerial revolution in all of these societies that have undergone this industrialization and technologization process, the question is, well, is it possible to surpass that? Is bureaucratization and managerialism, is that simply a feature of modernity? Because you could argue that, well, all right, if you're going to have mass societies, if you're going to have urbanization, and if you're going to have the kind of technological complexity that we have today, then that automatically means you're going to have a much wider degree of specialization and division of labor, which in turn requires a great deal of managerial coordination as well. And I think that that's a major problem that social theorists have to confront, because when you look at the different criticisms that different ideologies have of conventional society, on one hand, you have libertarians who claim, well, big government dominates everything. We've got these massive Leviathan states in the modern world. Or the left will say, well, the problem is there's a lack of democracy. Everything is centralized. Everything is oligarchical. Everything is hierarchical. We need more democracy. And then you also have, I guess, more traditionalist people who talk about the uprooting and eradicating of older or more traditional ways of life. And then, but a defender of modernity would argue, well, these are just inevitable features of societies that are technologically driven and are consequently mass societies and urban societies and things like that. And then there's this issue of whether we can ever get past that, because it's still true that if we look at all the different countries around the world where the technological revolution has really taken root, outside of somewhere like, say, the Central African Republic or whatever, we see that most societies have the same basic system. Most countries in the world today have, the public administration state was some kind of market economy, but it's not a free market like libertarians envision. It's sort of a managerial capitalism. But you have the commercial market, you have the public administration state, you have the independent sector of institutions that aren't really governmental or commercial. But then all of these are dominated by these kinds of managerial bureaucracies. So the big issue is whether it's possible to move past that and still have the benefits of modern technology like transportation and communication and healthcare and things like that.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Logos.
All right. So while I was dealing with an emergency, sorry for being late, I was thinking about this delineation between organon and systems. And something just didn't quite sit well with me. And as I was listening to people talk, especially a combination of Todd and Florian, it made me think that maybe there is a good middle ground between the two that really helps delineate things. And to come at it from my perspective, I do a lot of software work, R, Stata, Python, stuff like that, data analysis. And there are certain kind of functions you do in software work where it's like, yeah, I can clearly trust that this is how the computer is going to work. Let's say I do like a really basic linear regression, right? I could check by hand those formulas myself because they're all averages and variances and covariances and things like that. And with small numbers, it's really easy to plug the numbers in myself, make sure I get the same answer as the computer. And then I trust, in the same way that I trust that a hammer is really sturdy and it can, handle bigger and bigger nails or more odd situations where I have to swing the hammer, I can kind of trust the formulas they use are more robust to handle the issue. At the extreme other end, when you talk about systems, I think about like the systems explicitly using tools as people. I think we've all kind of agreed that like the verbiage here is using like technology dominates people instead of people using technology, right? So the people themselves are explicitly used as tools in the system. An interesting middle ground that I found where I was thinking about this is where people aren't explicitly used as tools by the system, but they're implicitly used as tools by the system. And where this middle ground happens is, let's say you're dealing with R. And with R, you have a bunch of different users making a bunch of different packages. And those packages have to talk to each other when dealing with very, very, more advanced regression stuff, whether it's lasso, whether it's, you name it. There's all sorts of techniques that require like 3 different, packages to function correctly. So each individual package, you have to trust that toolmaker like made the package robust and working. Then the packages have to talk to each other, singletons, pairs, all together. And all of that is going to influence the outcome. And if any stage of that doesn't work, you could unbeknowingly get results that aren't quite right because something's calibrated and you don't know like what's gone wrong. So I'm not explicitly, as a system or something, telling people what to do in managing or fixing their tools. But I can't use the tool in the way I want to use a tool and trust that it works unless I implicitly trust the people like upkeeping the parts of the system as tools. And so that I think is the third middle ground. I don't know what I would call it because I think like technology dominating people and moving them like pieces on a chessboard, like a system, I think that's a really cool name. I don't know what other name I'd call for this thing. But the question of like where's the ground when something like does or doesn't become a system, especially if we're talking about something as vague as technology, is an interesting question. And I think this middle ground could go a long way to answering it. I don't have much else. So
just real quick, Logos.
Sure.
If we look at when Eluo's talking about system, he's looking at the entire global technical interlocking system. So
right.
What you're talking about is still something embedded within it.
Yes.
And so it would still be limited by the systems theory analysis. You can't actually disentangle it from the system because it's a part of it.
Of course. I guess to make my commentary more specific, we're talking about technology broadly. And technology broadly can be thought of as anything from like a hammer, something we forged in a blacksmith with really old school tech, to something like a very complex social institution, like, I don't know, education or immigration, where people are moved around and numbers go up and down and so on and so forth. And so when I'm thinking about a piece of technology, like in our analysis of technology as a broad like class of objects, what I'm trying to figure out is when do pieces of technology or collections of technology become more descriptive of systems, and when may they still be organon? So I'd say like my calculator that I can do basic linear regression on, it's complex, but it's still organon. I plug in the data. I know why I'm plugging the data. I know what results I want it to give me. I just don't know the actual numbers, right? So I'd say that's in the realm of organon. But then once you start getting into like more complex software with multiple tools that talk to each other within the software, it starts getting more gray. And then once you start getting into software that tracks like institutional activity, then we're squarely on Illich's analysis of everything. And of course, insofar as we have like a system, everything's in a system. What I'm talking about is like, again, bits and pieces of the technological category. When can we add some technology and kind of like overstep our bounds into a whole system? And when can we have some technology to be like borderline, but we're okay?
Well, yeah. So a couple things. One is this kind of sounds like the attitude cultivated by the Adeptus Mechanicus in Warhammer 40K, right? They view the machine as a part of their own spiritual existence, that they're changing their relationship to the machine as they're worshiping it. But it's a little different. Back to your calculator example. Yeah, what I think, okay, this is what I think is important, because there's the Organon and then there's the distality. What makes system is that the tool itself determines and incorporates the use of the human in itself. So you're right, a calculator does not determine nor incorporate your use. So I think in that regard, we could say it's either in the category of distality or Organon. But yeah, you were going to say something, Florian. You had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, to that, because I've had a similar situation when I was doing my PhD and later postdoc in biology. I did a lot of microscopy images, and we used a tool that was called ImageJ, which is an open source program. It was very small at the beginning. It was called NIH Image, for National Institutes of Health Image. It was a very simple imaging program at first, but it was open source. It ran on Java. And all the scientists in the world that had something to do with image analysis would contribute new packages, right? So you had like in R, like Logo says with R, you have like in R, you have libraries that are added on. And I think in Python the same happens. But in ImageJ, you also had like plugins that were added and so on and so forth. So in a way, this broadly open source movement, everyone from the entire world would contribute aspects of the tool. So in the end, it became a great tool compared to other programs that we had, proprietary software, which were always talking to us, but couldn't get anything really right the way I wanted it. But ImageJ, every week there was something new, and it was always useful because people directly used that. Now, I thought about a little further. When I haven't used it for a while, but you can imagine a way in a program like that all of a sudden introduces compliance rules. All of a sudden, people have to adhere to a certain codex. People have to adhere, do certain research to be accepted, to have to contribute plugins and so on. At that point, when the tool demands, it's a collection of tools, right? And when the collection of tools all of a sudden demands that people behave in a certain way to then contribute to it, that I could then at that point, the tool could step over the threshold where it uses people as tools rather than the other way around. Maybe that is a danger that's innate in all open source projects.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Logos? That seems to be a response to you.
Yeah, I definitely see that from the endpoint of a programmer. I'm also thinking about it from the endpoint of a user. So for example, I ended up learning to like Stata and, what program did I use for experimental design? I don't remember. It'll come to me later. There's another program I ended up liking more because of the standards by which the tools were added. There was some predictability. So I could do in R sometimes the same functions with the same variables. And depending on my version of R, my version of the tools, each library had, updating one library relative to others could change the way they talk to each other in really weird ways and give me different results. And so as a user, what comes out of the tool isn't just a product of my intent. So in my simple calculator, if I plug in a bunch of numbers and say do a regression, I have some idea about what the calculator is going to do. And so I have some idea about what the answer is going to be. But in R, say, depending on like which versions my packages are, how well they're talking to each other and so on, as a user, I can't predict the outcome because I don't know what's talking to what. And so even if there's no like standard codex, sometimes I'll have to like look up and be like, listen, I'm getting these different results with these different versions of these packages. What's going on? And I'll see people argue on forums about like which version's best to use with what and why, and why the answers are different and so on. It's mind blowing. So the tool is no longer a product of my intent. Exactly. The outcome is a mixture of my intent and all the intermediate stuff that's going on with all these users under the scenes. Now, I, the user, am not dominated by R in the sense that R tells me what to do, but there's a sense in which I don't have direct control over what R spits out for me. And that's kind of the middle ground I'm talking about.
Okay, that really helps a lot, Logos, because that clarified on my end what you meant by that. Because as I mentioned, the first two ages of tools, the result is almost entirely determined by the human user. because it's something that's contained by the human user. But what you're talking about here is something that's produced by the broader technological system that is both used by the user, but also, because it's quasi-autonomous, interacting with these other packages.
Yes.
Yeah, it is in this weird. Well, you see, Illich died before that happened. He died in the early 21st century, so he would never have been able to see this. And I don't know if any sort of like science theorists or sci-fi authors predicted this. So I don't know if he would have had any chance to relate to that at all. So that's a very interesting middle ground. I wouldn't have been aware of that. But see, the other thing too is if we look at the danger that the technology, the tool itself, incorporates, not through some sort of will, it's not actively thinking, but it's an already existing process, right? So in a sense, you could say if you're sailing a boat on the ocean, the process of the tides and the wind control you, but that's just nature. That's just the human condition since forever. This is different. This is something we've constructed that now imitates that. And it then imposes costs on us to act and behave. Now, if we were to look at what is necessary to maintain the technical apparatus, i.e. specifically trained engineers able to do the work that are socially adept enough to actually get by in life, and we all know that engineers are generally not socially adept, but it's just worse with Zoomers now. You won't even be able to have functioning people that can do the work. Now, if it turns out that it's the case that in order to meet the current needs of the machine, so the system, say at time t, where t is our current instance of time, you have to do all sorts of things that have nothing to do with becoming a good engineer. The machine eats its own tail because it's imposing costs on people at every iteration of time to conform to it. Otherwise, they just won't get what they need: food, clothes, shelter, everything else. But at the same time they're doing that, it's moving them further and further away from what they actually need to be doing to be able to become skilled enough to maintain the machine. If we hold to that, then there does seem to be the problem that the machine can be its own gravedigger. I'll give it to you, Keith. You haven't spoken in a bit.
One thing we haven't really touched on is the role of technology as an instrument of political control and authoritarianism. The most obvious example of that are the surveillance capabilities and tracking capabilities that technology provides. For instance, in old times, in the pre-industrial era, if you were a fugitive, it was a lot easier to be a fugitive. You just went somewhere where nobody knew you, and that was about it. Sure, they might send out a bounty hunter or posse or something to track you down, but it was certainly a lot easier to evade that. Even in the industrial era, it's possible. It was a lot more possible to be a successful fugitive. That's not to say every reason everybody has for being a fugitive might be a good reason, but it was certainly possible. Nowadays, it's practically impossible to be a successful fugitive because we're so dependent on technology. To be a fugitive today, you would have to probably go to some remote area of the world. You would have to live off the grid. You would have to certainly not be plugged into any of the technological system. You obviously couldn't have a cell phone or a bank account or a credit card or something like that. So the means of tracking individuals and the means of conducting surveillance that institutions have today, states and other institutions have, is certainly unprecedented. And that leads back to this question of, well, are we all going to end up living in the panopticon? Are we going to all end up living in a society where we're being surveilled 24/7? What's going to happen when technology is developed that can see through walls? Is it going to be that the National Security Agency has the ability to monitor you in your house while you're asleep at night? That's certainly something to consider. Now, that may sound like science fiction, but then a lot of the technology we have today would have been science fiction until not too long ago. And I see this as extremely problematic. even without the technology that sees through walls, there's just about every other method there is now of tracking you. Think about how you have to constantly have all of these numbers that are following you around. Your driver's license, your social security card, all of these passwords you have to have for everything. How everything now you're more or less expected to do online. For example, if you want to get a job, they expect you to fill out an online job application. If you want to have a paycheck, more and more employers require you to have direct deposit. So you have this technology that you're trapped in that you're really not able to escape. Again, unless you want to have a very meager existence way out on the margins off the grid somewhere. And increasingly, it's going to be more and more difficult to do that because with satellite surveillance and things like that, they can track those people too. So we have technologies of control now that the Big Brother character in 1984 certainly would have dreamed about. And is that inevitable? Again, that gets back to the question I raised earlier. Is this inevitable? Are these managerial bureaucracies that we see accompanying technological expansion, are those inevitable? And then is this kind of surveillance system and tracking system that where everybody's sort of living in this permanent panopticon, is that inevitable? That remains to be seen. If it's not, then how do we get that under control? What do we do to resist that or prevent that from happening?
Well, okay, that's actually a really good point, Keith, because this ties into something else that's related that I wanted to get at. That's related to the idea of being bound by the system, not being able to step outside of the system. So there was a Marine Corps general named Paul K. Van Riper, who in 2002, during the Millennium Challenge War Games, played Team Red in a Persian Gulf scenario, which for game purposes either was Iraq or Iran. I'm guessing Iran because at that point, Iraq was about to be invaded. And he sinks an entire carrier task force. What's interesting here is he uses all these asymmetric tactics. He uses suicide kamikaze boats. He fires missiles and rockets. But the key thing that's really interesting, he doesn't use digital or radio communication. He used analog communication. So for example, he used, because Team Blue, the U.S., so representing the U.S., could read all your radio and digital traffic and know where you were instantaneously. So he had motorcycle messengers. He used light signals and all these like World War II era analog type stuff. And it's like, wow, see, the thing is, once you get so good at like all these communication systems, and then you can then track those communication systems, your opposition is going to be like, maybe I shouldn't use those communication systems because you're actually going to be able to track me. But then you might say, well, of course, but wouldn't somebody, see through that? Well, no, because in the 2002 war game, they restarted the game and changed the rules so Riper couldn't do that. So the U.S. wasn't willing to accept defeat on those terms. And then second of all, if you are dominated by systems thinking, then you're not going to think in terms of this asymmetry that because Riper's representing the Islamist terrorist side. So of course, that's how they're going to try to think. You just can't think that way. And of course, one of my common themes is if you can't think about it, you won't look for it. And so there actually is this kind of feedback loop where I think it was Foucault talks about like there was this shadow that existed in older authoritarian regimes. Because of lack of technology, communications, tyrants and emperors could only police and surveil so much. Robin Hood could hide in the woods. People could hide Christians could hide in the catacombs, right? You could escape. And so the new way of escape is going to be to decouple from these modern communication systems. And if we believe the results of the Millennium Challenge war game, it can actually lead to military success by insurgent forces. So I think what's going to also happen too, and we see this, I think, in Afghanistan as well, anything outside of that system's mindset, it just doesn't exist from the point of view of the user. And so you're going to start losing, but there's still a real world out there beyond the system you've built. and that real world is still going to exert pressure on you, which if you can't account for will eventually break the machine. That's the theory I'm running with. So Logos, what about you?
So thinking about these comments about surveillance and other things, so I was thinking about how we can think about this middle ground as kind of like a mechanism. And to illustrate this, let's just use a social institution like, say, education. I love to lurk the teacher subreddit. It's just fun. And some of the big stuff that they're talking about is male teachers getting accused by disgruntled students of sexual harassment. Now, that basically spawned a discussion about what to do about that problem that mirrors exactly what we're talking about here. Namely, one of the biggest debates they were having is, should we have cameras in classrooms, owing to Keith's point about surveillance? So what has happened is that we have tried to monkey with our systems about student punishment, the authority we place on teachers, abilities for children to report child abuse, and so on. We've given children a lot more technology and wherewithal to use these systems. Children are abusing them. So we have one of two options. We either rescind the systemic changes we've given children to do this, or we have to one-up the technological solution to the technological problem that our previous technological solution created. Cameras in the classroom. Suddenly, the teacher, the students, everybody's under surveillance. So if a student says, teacher A made me feel uncomfortable, touched me inappropriately, whatever, at this date and time, we now have a camera record that says, no, they didn't, right? There will be no he said, she said, because the system can't tolerate that kind of gray area. Because think about what happens, right? If the system errs on the side of the teacher and gets it wrong, you have a teacher systemically abusing kids. If the teacher errs on the side of a kid, you could have a teacher basically reputation destroyed, booted out of a system, mind you, which is already churning teachers at a rapid rate, right? I mean, we're churning teachers like it's one of the highest turnover professions in America, as far as I know. I could be wrong, but that's what I've heard. Maybe it's propaganda. Anyway, so they're already having problems keeping teachers. And so if you have this extra thing, the system can't tolerate a gray area either way, because either way is unthinkable. And so the only thing it can do is up the ante and say, we're going to surveil. And thinking about my middle ground thing, it's like this. It's like once we have kind of like opened Pandora's box and changed the way that students interact with authority, students can complain to a higher up about teacher behavior, these things happen, which can be seen as good in their ends. It introduces the middle ground I was talking about, where inputs are going to happen, but outputs are going to happen independent of the intent of the system. So the system might intend certain protections from students, and they might think they have certain protections from teachers, but outcomes could happen that could harm teachers or students from this, not due to the intent of like the administrators, the human actors trying to police the system, but independent of it. So it's kind of in that gray area, right? And this is where, as Keith pointed out, now we start looking at political surveillance. Now we look at things to crack down even more and resolve contradictions within the system. And that's kind of what surveillance by the state is meant to do. So think about individual terrorists that can now get their hands on tactical nuclear weapons. Think about tragic cases where you have like little girls like kidnapped and hidden in guys' basements until they escape at the age of like 21. Think about all sorts of things that happen. And society says, this is terrible. We got to stamp out these gray areas. And as technology makes it easier for people to like, kidnap people, hurt people, whatever, you kind of want to up the ante to make sure that we intend no harm. We're going to make sure the system outputs no harm, and surveillance is like one way of doing it. So it's like in order to get out of this uncanny valley that I talked about with like R and chaotic outputs, basically. I think that's why the system tends toward authoritarianism, to like jump the uncanny valley.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting you said there, Logos. This ties in what Jacques Ellul says in On Technique, where he says that once a system becomes super complex, its outcomes become unpredictable. So, for example, in a simple mechanism like a car, if you put your foot on the accelerator, you expect it to speed up. And it does, because it's a simple mechanism. But once you have a super complex mechanism with interlocking parts, you might be pressing a button and it looks like nothing's happening, but it's just not what you expected to happen, and you don't even know what's happening.
Exactly.
That's what you're describing. And
yeah,
Ellul's writing before Illich, but I don't know if they ever like communicated. Florian.
Yeah, good points. I thought about, like, when we're talking about first of all, the cost and technology that we have, and I just want to add that to the discussion, is a very slow moving cost, right? It's a very slowly imposed cost. If you think about it, technology is maybe like an ocean liner that's like moving quite certainly on its own, and you take out a manager somewhere on that ship, that nothing really happens, right? It's like I forgot the name, was a famous lawyer who brought that analogy for governments, like they're like ocean liners. You can take out people, it still goes forward, right? And if you think about that, got me thinking about there's videos on YouTube where they reanimate the sinking of the Titanic in 1 hour, and it was astounding. In 1 hour, the ship sank, but for the first 45 minutes, nothing happened. And really, I mean, yeah, the ship like sank down a little bit, but if you were on the ship and nobody told you, you wouldn't have thought that Titanic was about to sink. But then in the last 15 minutes, mayhem broke loose, of course, right? Because then everything happened very quickly. And if you think about these people knew the outcome. These people knew that there is like the ship will sink in the end, even if you don't believe in it. That's a clear outcome. Now with technology and with that kind of change, we don't even know where that goes. We could be doomed, and it could happen very quickly because it has been in the preparation for maybe we are going towards doom, and we have done that for 30 years and nobody realized anything because we don't even know what the next step will be, what kind of doom will wait for us, right? That could definitely happen. So that's also one pitfall with modern technology, if it becomes too overburdening, right? And then also there's maybe that can be something like a more optimistic final word type of statement. You always have in any dystopian novels, any catastrophe, and if you think about, there's always one group of people that is kind of like out of the system, right? It's like the people that, like in 1984, those were the broad people that were, maybe you can call them Lumpenproletariat, or people that were going to games and watching TV and nothing happened to them, right? They were kind of like completely outside, like the forgotten people, right? Or there was a Black Mirror episode where a social credit system is implemented, and there's one woman who fails some of these social credit checks and ends up destitute. Nobody wants to do anything with her, and she finds like some female trucker, and the female trucker helps her, and she basically joins a community that's outside the social credit system, but that may be a community that is viable in and of itself, that is not operating in any social credit system. I saw, and maybe that can be kind of a white pill in this context. I saw a recent post on X where somebody talked about a person who became a millionaire via Bitcoin, and he lives now on a trailer park in Alabama. Completely, I'm basically hiding in plain sight, right? That's not something that the system will get wise to, that there are people who are living completely stealth mode, but that way he can circumvent any system that wants to surveil him, right? He just lives. Nobody would suspect that somebody who is rich lives in a trailer park in Alabama, but he has his freedom there, and he's basically not bothered by anyone, right? So whatever technology develops, there's always a way to to step outside. If Ted Kaczynski wouldn't have resorted to bombing people, he would have been able to live in that hut like until he died. There would be no jail for him. He just would have lived in the woods. That was not his purpose, I understand, but there's always a way to skirt the system and live outside, I think. And that's maybe a good news.
Well, yeah, that's basically Foucault's shadow, and it's always going to exist. Technology just shortens the distance of time and space, but it can't eliminate it, and it just shunts things into other areas. But it's about time to wrap up, so we'll start with you, Keith. What were some of your final thoughts on all this?
Well, I think one thing that is a challenge in today's world is that when we talk about critiquing institutions, I've done quite a bit of writing and speaking on the question of power elites and things like that. But the technological elite is as much a part of that as anything, because it's the technological apparatus that to a large degree provides modern institutions with their power. And therefore, those who are plugged into the technological apparatus the most, who are the overlords of the technological apparatus, are increasingly a powerful group of people. We talk a lot in different conversations about the tech oligarchs. A lot of people are talking about, nowadays we have this new wave of tech oligarchs like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all of these kinds of characters, Bill Gates. But it's the technological apparatus that makes those people what they are. Just like in the 19th century, we had the rise of the industrial bourgeoisie. We had the John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and people like that. Now, Musk and Zuckerberg and Gates are the new versions of those people. And the question is going to be, well, are those tech oligarchs going to eventually, or maybe not the ones we have now, but their descendants and others like them, are they going to eventually become the dominant class worldwide in the same way that, say, the oil bankers are the dominant class today? And I think that's entirely plausible that will happen, that will become the dominant class, the tech oligarchs, those who are the overlords of technology. And you see elites within some technological institutions talking about how they want to have a reversion to some sort of high-tech feudalism. I know Peter Thiel seems to be an advocate of that. Let's go back to older models of society, but with modern technology. So he postulates the idea of some sort of techno-feudalism or something of that nature. And I can certainly see some kind of dystopia of that type evolving in the future. And then there's the question of how do you resist that, if everything is surveilled on the level that it is. I mean, if they want to find you, they can find you. With satellite surveillance is such that, you can go on websites like Zillow.com and you can find satellite photographs of just about any house anywhere in the world. At least anything that's in their archives. For instance, when I worked in industries related to construction and home remodeling and real estate and stuff like that, you could go on various websites and you could actually find a satellite photograph of a house in a particular neighborhood, and get a picture of it. And sometimes you would even see the people that live there sitting outside or something like that. The means of tracking you is already there. It's very difficult to evade the system. Even living a hermit-like existence, if they wanted to find you, they could. I think this is the real challenge that we have today: is how do we go about resisting this, or is that even possible?
Yeah. Okay. Logos, final thoughts.
I don't know. I think I've said most of what I want to say during the thing. I'm still thinking about it. I think where my thoughts are ending on it is more mechanistic. So what is the process? How is the thing moving from one stage to another stage to another stage? Can it be stopped in the middle? Is there a middle point we even want to stop it at? I'm not even sure I know the answer to those questions. So yeah, still thinking.
All right, cool. Florian, you get the last word today.
Yeah, thanks. I think what Keith said is true, and I was thinking that as I also wrote in the chat, that the only way to avoid detection is to be unknown. So the system doesn't even know what it looks for and who is looking for, right? For example, I had on one of my web pages, I had not even it couldn't be hacked because nobody would be able to type in the URL /login because I had modified that URL. So you need to know that I don't even have that word as a login way, right? But if you want to, you can always, and you need to have someone ping on the radar of the system. And here's the problem, because in the past, you always had the people that are willing to go beyond the system that were actually pushing humanity forward, right? So most people would not be like Columbus and try to convince everyone that there is a passageway to India, to the west, and that he was a scoundrel basically, and he didn't have much to do with the system, and he just knew how to use the system for his own purpose. But you need people like that who are kind of choosing to stand outside the system to develop the system. Otherwise, if you have a system that looks inward and everyone can be tracked, that's a system that will implode over time because nothing new is developing. The whole system will not grow. It will deteriorate over time. And systems that don't grow will deteriorate, I think. And that is another challenge that technology brings with us. So, but humanity is always, people are always ingenious enough to find ways to skirt the system. And for that reason, I'm rather optimistic. But it's a bigger problem than it was in the past.
All right. Thank you again, Keith, Florian, Logos. It's always a pleasure. It's Todd Lewis, Razorfly Podcast, signing off.